Emes. I'm a Senior Director at Ipsos MORI, and I'm a Millennial. Oh, I wasn't expecting that. Thank you. I'm delighted to see so many of you here to join the discussion about my much derided generation. We at Ipsos MORI have a very long history of generations research. We're very, very interested in it. In fact, we're so passionate about generational analysis that we have created our own sculpture highlighting a key piece of analysis that has pride of place in Ipsos MORI HQ in our reception. And there it is if you haven't already seen it. But generational analysis is not simply an academic exercise. It's actually really important, and it helps us understand how things are changing or perhaps not changing in the world. So, why millennials? Why are we still banging on about millennials when so much has been written about this generation? Well, frankly, that's part of the problem. So much has been written, and so much of it is complete and utter nonsense, as we're about to find out. We're talking about millennials because we are actually a very, very important generation. And this isn't just the sort of stereotypical millennial narcissism coming out in me. We really do matter. And it's not because we are at the leading edge of trends anymore. We've passed that mantle on to the next generation. Frankly, I think I am living proof that we're not really that young and we're not really that hip and cool anymore. Oh, thank you. Thanks. Depending on your definition, a millennial is generally considered to be somebody born between 1980 and 1995. So for those of us who are what I think is officially termed an original millennial, this means that we're fast approaching 40. And if I'm honest, the sorts of things that keep me awake at night are not whether I'm going to get many likes on the Instagram photo of my latest meal, but frankly, the size of my mortgage, and whether the local comprehensive secondary school is going to improve enough so that my daughter can go there in a few years' time. So we matter, and we matter because there are so many of us. We make up around a quarter of the UK population now, and in emerging markets such as India, it's about 40% of the population that are now millennials. Now, we are a large generation, and we are a generation that is now moving to the phase where we are sort of the most economically powerful that we're probably ever going to be. But sadly, we are sort of shrouded by so much myth. So I'm personally very excited that Bobby's shortly going to join the stage and start busting some of those myths about our generation.
There's loads of bad research out there on millennials, as Claire has said. It's not hard to find the examples just from casting around. So apparently, there's a lot about blame around millennials. So you can blame millennials for the vanishing bar of soap, according to one article. You can blame them for killing the McDonald's McWrap, according to another article. One of the worst things that we found out about millennials is that apparently they are killing the napkin industry. No one ever thinks of the napkin industry in these situations. Someone has to think of the napkin industry. Not quite as bad as that. They apparently killed the EU. I didn't actually know the EU was dead, but the millennials killed them. Did they really ruin the Olympics? I quite enjoyed the Olympics. I don't remember it being particularly ruined. They're not content with just ruining the future. They've got to ruin their babies' lives as well as their own lives by giving them increasingly strange names. They can't cook. Fair enough. They don't know how to have friends, not even make friends. They don't know how to have friends. And then there's loads and loads of bad stuff on work-based things that you'll have seen. They're significantly more likely to show up late for work. And then they are snowflake millennials infuriating their senior colleagues with their workplace antics. Why don't they? They really do need to know their place. And that's from William Hanson, who is the etiquette expert at Mail Online, if you ever want to look up William Hanson. But there are loads of really, really bad work-based things, which I won't have time to go into in this presentation, but it is generally, across the piece, when we've looked at the evidence, not much difference in workplace things. So do bear that in mind when you have a look at that. So that has an effect on how people view them. It seems to have an effect. This is from our Global Trend Survey, where we asked people in 23 different countries the words to describe different cohorts, different generations generational groups. And for millennials, this is the top 5. So this is 16,000 people that we've asked globally about this. The top 5 characteristics are tech savvy, which is good, but then materialistic, selfish, lazy, and arrogant for the millennials. And we thought maybe that's just because people are always nasty about other generations when they think about them. So we asked about baby boomers as well. And for people who can see that, baby boomers is represented by our own Ben Page on this, who can't unfortunately be with us today, but archetypal baby boomer in many different ways. So when we ask people what the characteristics are that are most associated with baby boomers, it's these. Respectful, work-centric. It is funny seeing those group of things next to Ben in some ways. I mean, I am not going to give any comment on how many of those apply to Ben. I'll just say all of them is... But so, very positive view of baby boomers. And the sad thing is, in some ways, millennials also describe themselves like that, in the same way as people describe them generally. So 44% say their generation is materialistic. 37% selfish, 33% lazy. So it's kind of got through to the generation themselves, so that self-image. But then, of course, youth always does have a dodgy reputation. It doesn't take long, again, looking back in history to find examples of that. So the morals of the young are tenfold worse than formerly, said the Earl of Shaftesbury in 1843. A race of effeminate, self-admiring, emaciated fribbles, which could be from the Mail Online's etiquette expert, I think. It's the same sort of theme as that, but that was actually a Town and Country magazine letter from 1771. And then youth were never more saucy. Yeah, never more, and I love this phrase, savagely saucy. And that's from 1624, Thomas Barnes, minister of St. Margaret's Church. So this hints at some of the issues with this. It's kind of separating youth-based things from cohort-based things. So what's generational, what's just about young people? And that's what we try to do in generational research, to understand what type of change we're seeing. So there's only really 3 types of change that explain all changes in attitudes or behaviours over time. There can be period effects, which are where attitudes and behaviours of all cohorts, everyone, change in a similar sort of way over the same period of time. Something happens, which could be an event or it could be a general gradual change in values over time. Life cycle effects, which is where something happens within your own life, where that changes your attitudes and behaviours, and that's classic life events like having children, getting married, moving into work, moving into retirement, those types of things. And then cohort effects, which a cohort born at a particular time, socialised in a particular way, has different views of behaviours, and they stay different, stay with them in some way throughout their life. And it's not impossible to entirely unpick this with the sort of data we're looking at here. We're looking at cross-sectional data. We don't have long-term longitudinal studies that some of our clients in here do over this period, over these types of issues. But you can get an idea in a very simple way that we'll show you in a second. And we've mapped millions, literally millions of interviews in order to connect all these different cohorts, as you'll see some of it. And one of the things that is really important to understand about generational research seems quite academic and retrospective, but that's not the point. The point is, if you understand which effects are working within your data, you can help predict the future. All these different effects have different impacts on the future. So this is actually a very forward-looking approach. So, time for our quiz. And this is where you need your cards. Everyone got cards? Hold up your cards and just check if everyone's got their cards. So, this very simple format is basically, I'll give you 5 questions. We're going to do 5 questions during this, and you just hold up whether you think millennials are more likely to be a healthy weight than Generation X were at the same time. Is that a myth or a reality? Oh my God, it's absolutely split down the middle. You can't see this, I can see this. It's split down the middle, myth and reality. So at least some of you are happy it's actually a myth entirely. Well, it is, honest. It is definitely a myth. It is a myth. But there's some reasons why you might think it's true, so I'll come to those in a second. So you can see that in these very, very simple sorts of charts. So we've taken Health Survey for England. This is just in the UK, well, in England, in fact. And this is the percentage that are healthy weight in the different cohorts, so not age groups, but cohorts. So you've got the pre-war generation. So they're quite old when it goes back to 1992, but quite old when they start. And it kind of levels out at 30%. Who are around a healthy weight. So it kind of gets to that level and it stays like that. Baby boomers, same sort of thing. more were a healthy weight, and then it's gone down to reach 30%. And I find this really strangely reassuring. That if you get to about 50-odd and you're a healthy weight, you're in the 30% that's going to stay a healthy weight in some way. So there is something quite reassuring about our future, because I'm in Gen X, and we're heading that way. We're getting fatter all the time, too. We're heading down towards 30% of us having a healthy weight. And here are millennials. So currently, more of them are a healthy weight. So if you took a cross-section now, they're a healthy weight, but that's entirely because they're young. So if you compare Gen X at the same average age as millennials are more or less now, so that's at 26, 53% of my generation were a healthy weight when they were an average age of 26, and it's now down to 48% of millennials that are a healthy weight. So I think this is probably true, that it's the first generation ever in the UK where under half are a healthy weight while they're still in their 20s. Well, still the bulk of them are actually in their 20s. So all the kind of healthy living stuff outweighed by obesity, all the obesity pressures and etc. So not that you would think this if you looked at the research, some of the bad research out there, and I don't want to particularly pick on Goldman Sachs, but this is a Goldman Sachs piece of work, only because it's widely referred to, this Goldman Sachs piece of work on millennials. So first claim for millennials, wellness is a daily active pursuit. And I think we all know millennials where that's not the case. Not all millennials are daily and actively pursuing health. But we've looked in the report at each of these individual claims. Exercising more is actually true. More active, that more of them meet the activity guidelines than Gen X at the same age. Eating smarter doesn't seem to be true at all. In things like sugar consumption, way over the recommended limits. And more so than Gen X now, but even more so than Gen X were when they were young. So that's the key bit. So there's a cohort generational trend there too. And smoking's very interesting. You can have a look at that in the report. They started off with a lower level of smoking, but they're giving up more slowly than previous generations of that age. So they've actually switched positions, and then now the most likely to smoke out of the different cohorts that we're looking at. So it's kind of switched around. And that's to do with the theme that we're going to pick up throughout this. It's about delayed adulthood. They're getting later to marriage, later to having kids, all those types of things. And all of those triggers for giving up are slower. And this is quite a really important trend within the data. Second question. Millennials say they trust other people less than older generations. So this is other people in the ordinary public. So so if you think that's real, millennials do trust less. Hold up green side and red side. So I would say that's, God, you're very evenly split. There's more green here, but more red over there. So you're pretty split on this. This is actually a reality, which, ooh, I know. So you've got lots of untrusting millennials around you. Be careful around them. There's some good reasons for that. So less likely to trust other people. So this is from our veracity index, which is whether you trust the ordinary man and woman in the street to tell the truth. And these are the patterns that you see. That's the pre-war generation about there. So the dip in 2001 is September the 11th attacks. And it's like a big impact, but then bounces back very quickly. So it's got this sort of resilience, this level of trust. And you can see the trend is up. Baby boomers follow a very, very similar sort of pattern on levels of trust. Gen X, my generation, almost overlapping with it. And then you've got millennials, which are way, way down there and staying down there in terms of level of trust. And I think this is underexplored. Robert Putnam in the US has done much more on this, but in a UK context, this particular standing out of this generation, there's much more generational gradient within the US data. This stands out within the UK as this trust issue is millennial. And there's lots of discussion of this, well, some discussion of this, probably not enough, but no massively convincing explanations. The most convincing that I've seen is it's a communications technology thing, that because they see much more of people acting badly towards other people in some senses, just even down to pranks and things, that level of trust is affected by that. One thing to note, there is no millennial crisis of trust in institutions, business, adverts, those types of things. This is much more in the report. There is disconnection with lots of institutions and elements of business, but it's not trust-based. It's much more about efficacy and relevance than trust. There is no crisis of trust within millennials at an institutional level. The issue is with ordinary people. So, third question. I think millennials are more focused on brand purpose than previous generations. That's ethics, brand ethics, corporate responsibility, however you want to call it, all the different sorts of terms, lots more realities lots more realities, a few myths here from people who've read the stuff mostly, because it is a myth. Yeah. Yeah. You can see who's read the report through this. I can just pick you all out from this. So that is, in fact, a myth. So we got this Sustainable Business Monitor, which is a great resource because it goes back quite a long way. So we go back to 1999, we looked to Generation X when they were aged 20 to 33, and just on these two simple measures. So it's only on a couple of simple measures, whether you boycotted a product on the basis of their behavior or chose a product because of its responsible behavior. And it was 17% on both of those things in Generation X. Millennials in 2015, actually about the same on boycotting, but lower on choosing a product or service than Generation X at the same age, because this is very life cyclical as well. It goes round, up and down according to life cycle stages. So this, just to be really clear on this doesn't mean to say that brand purpose is not important or not a coming trend. It just means that it's not generationally driven. It's driven by all sorts of other things. So putting it down to millennials driving it is not correct. But that doesn't mean to say it's not important for business. Millennials are having less sex than... This is not aimed at any... Okay. Are you answering on a personal basis or about the... didn't expect that. So vote now on a group basis to the question, not on your personal life, please. Millennials are having less sex than Gen X did at the same time. So reality and myth. It is actually a bit of a cheat, this one, because it's kind of a bit of both. Hold on. It's not that much of a choose. I would say it's more a reality than a myth, but I'll just showing you the lots of different ways in which to measure sexual activity and the different, if you can do it. This is a serious session on big social trends. But on this one, this is a massive thing. So I should have made clear at the beginning we're talking about Americans here. This is US data, so it doesn't apply to this room. So this is not saying anything, judging you in any sort of way in either generation. But so in America, Generation X, average age of 27 in 2000, 19% hadn't had sex in the last 4 weeks. Millennials in 2014, same average age, 32%. Big shift in this. And again, it relates back to those big trends that we've seen about later life choices or delayed adulthood, in the sense of fewer in long-term relationships, fewer married, those types of things. So that kind of frequency of sex thing is going to be lower because of those lifestyle changes. But on the other hand, the thing that makes it slightly more myth-like is millennials are more likely to have had multiple sexual partners in the last year. So had sex with 3 or more people in the last year. These are the trends. So red is millennials, blue is Gen X. And if you look at Gen X in sort of 2000, when they were a similar sort of average age, compare that with millennials, now it's gone up a little bit. So this kind of brings out a second theme, which is important from a lifestyle perspective, is it's a kind of diversification of lifestyles, a stretching of lifestyles within this group, so which is a really important thing. It used to be fairly uniform, people moving through life stages, but there's more stretching of different sorts of lifestyles within this group. Final question. Millennials will vote less in the 2017 general election than Gen did at the same age. Reality, myth, you're really evenly split. This is good. Cool. Sort of half and half. Actually, we don't know. A bit unfair, that one, because we didn't give you an orange card to put up. And that's not just because we're pollsters and we can't tell what's going to happen in elections, but there is an element of that. It's much more that it's actually quite hard to tell on this. Elections are voting is an absolute classic of a mix of period, cohort, and life cycle effects that all interact. So if you look at baby boomers, 1983 general election, when there was an average age of 28, incredible. This is claim turnout, but an incredible turnout, 79%, and only 4 percentage points behind the average. So even though they were pretty young, they were voting more and less in line with the rest of the population. Generation X, though, by the time you get to 1997, a very engaging election in some ways. Only 65% claim turnout and 14% behind the average claim turnout. So quite a big gap between the two. And then millennials, lower again in terms of claim. Yeah, it is low. Lower again in terms of, and this is claimed turnout rather than validated, so it would be lower in practice, but only 58%, but only 15 percentage points behind the average, because engagement with elections changes depending on the election, changes over time. So actually not a big difference between Gen X and millennials in terms of level of engagement. If we're looking for a break in the duty to vote, the sense of having to vote, it's earlier, it's Gen X rather than millennials. So we'll see how that goes. But there is one massive generational trend within our work, which is support for one connection to an individual political party. So these are the patterns, all the way back to 1983. So you've got pre-war generation up there. 60% say they feel connected to one particular political party, and it's ruler flat. It kind of goes along up and down around elections a little bit, but ruler flat overall. Baby boomers dropped down quite a lot, 40%, but again, really flat. Gen X again to 30%, and then millennials again to 20%. So this is like the death of traditional political parties being able to rely on a certain amount of votes from people. So the fluidity of politics that this suggests for the future is really, really important. So summing up bits. There is all sorts of claim-defining features of millennials. When you look at the literature on this, people would say it's the conflict generation, narcissistic generation, entitled, entrepreneurial, etc. There's no real evidence for lots and lots of these things. There's a defining characteristics. There may be elements of it, but defining characteristics doesn't seem to be true. There are some real patterns within it. The more materialism does seem to be, there's evidence of that, more focused on materialistic things, even for the generation, even being young, even comparing young with young over time, some elements of that. They're always called moaning snowflakes, that type of thing, and there's a lot of focus on their complaints, but they're also more praising when they're pleased with things. They just give more feedback in some ways, in certain circumstances, in certain sorts of ways. So it's not just about complaints, it's about praise as well. They're also called a kind of word-of-mouth generation, that word of mouth is the only thing that matters to them. Other communications don't. That is not true. The real pattern is that they use multiple sources of information to come to decisions. They're much more used to triangulating lots of different sources to come to the decision, of which word of mouth is an important one, but so are other communications. Do have higher education levels in most countries, not the US, but most other countries. You can see this increasing level of degree education across certainly the UK and a lot of Europe. And then delayed marriage and children, lots of really important and big trends in that. But behind those, we think there's two true millennial megatrends that cause a lot of these things and cause a lot of the other stuff that we've seen, which is financially screwed in many ways. So financial constraint in the West. The report, when you see it, also looks at emerging markets, and that's a very different story. But in the West, financial constraint leading to a lot of these delays in adulthood, traditional views of adulthood. And then the influence of communications technology. That is really quite defining in many ways. Just to pick up a couple of slides that show some of that. Loads more on technology in the report. And on smartphones, there's not big differences in access. There's not big differences in lots of aspects to it compared to Generation X. But there are massive differences in things like this. The number of minutes spent on a smartphone per week is that compared across the different generations. So you've got nearly 1,500 minutes of millennials spending time on their smartphones, and it halves, more than halves, to about 600 odd for Generation X, and then halves again for baby boomers and the pre-war generations. You've got this very different intensity of use and types of use, which we go into more in the report. Very, very different on that. Not on access, but on this. And then on the financially screwed element of it, David will talk about that more, because the Resolution Foundation has done some brilliant work outlining that and unpicking that. But just to take one sort of implication of that in some ways, this is the percentage of the different generations that's still living with their parents at different age groups. So you've got Generation X in the blue, and it goes down quite well and quite steeply. And then you've got millennials, which is kind of holding on to that. And when you look at the data in practice, there's this massive, massive gap between the two. So when Generation X were again about 26, 27, 20% of them lived with their parents, still live with their parents. And now millennials, 31% of them live with their parents. And that's a massive societal shift that has all sorts of implications for government services, for markets, etc., etc. So That's all I can cover in this, but there's much, much more in the 200-page report. But there is shorter versions. There's shorter versions of the report. But just, I do have to give thanks to the people who did it. With there's a massive effort from Hannah Shrimpton, Michael Clements, and Palicta, but also many other millennials who, despite being millennials, did all the hard work. Thank you very much.